Today we're going to be doing second in a series on the book Stamped: Racism, Antiracism, and You, part of BI Reads for Justice. Something to talk about is sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which offers innovative and compassionate care up on Rolling Bay. And they also offer day stay and respite programs. Call 360-689-4314 to learn more. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water who have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial. And we are grateful for their hospitality and we honor them. Today, we are going to take a look at the second in the multi-part parts of Stamped, which is the book that we're reading at Bainbridge Island as a community right now. So, Anne Lovejoy, if you'll unmute the conference room and welcome us, we'll get started.
Indeed. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I see lots of faces from last time. Thank you for that. And welcome to people who are coming for the first time. These are drop-ins, so you can come to each one, everyone, or come to only one. It doesn't really matter if you've read the book or finished the book or are just interested in the book. You're still welcome, and we are very happy to have you here. If you want to put questions and comments in the chat, if you're online, that will be helpful to keep a track of what's going on here. I hope that you will find this as enriching and stimulating as I have, as I think many of us have. And again, please, your comments and questions are very welcome. We'll try to make sure everybody gets a chance to be heard. And if you saw before, Rita had put up the our guidelines, but I'll just repeat them for anyone who didn't see them. The ground rules are pretty simple. Just be curious. Listen to understand, be respectful, no crosstalk or interrupting, and what I like to call share the air. Limit your comments to 2 or 3 minutes, just to make sure everybody gets a chance to be heard. And the facilitators will be timekeepers. And again, I'm just going to ask as a start off, how many here have actually read all or some of the book? So quite a few, great. Anybody listen to the audiobook as well or instead? Yeah, again, I recommend that so highly as Jason Reynolds is such an engaging reader. And I guess one of the pieces I'd like to start off with is one of the general questions to get us thinking about how this all, the indoctrination part. Is there a strong race-related memory that shaped and still influences your life? Has anybody got a memory that you've been thinking about while reading this book and realizing that you've had this strong influence going on maybe for years? Rita?
Well, I don't know if it's an indoctrination, but when I was young, we lived in Milwaukee. And of course, Milwaukee back in the early 50s, you know, everybody had their own neighborhoods that they lived in. And my mom was taking me someplace and we were on the streetcar and I had never seen a Black person, period. And there was a woman there with a baby. I pointed and I said really loud, "Look at that Black baby." And my mom, of course, was just horrified. But I had never seen a Black baby and I was just thought it was quite interesting. It wasn't good or bad. It was just something that I had never seen. And I think depending on where you've been brought up and where you've lived, I mean, we just lived in a very segregated city at the time. And as I said, like the week before, when I was a little older, Milwaukee was integrating the schools in the city and we were moved into a Black public housing project. And I was the only white child in my class. Wow. And my sisters were. So it was a real different kind of a, you know, life experience young.
I had a similar experience about the same age. What a coincidence. We were visiting a cousin of my mother's in Chicago. And I said, I want to go for a ride on the L. I want to take the L, the L is the Chicago Mass Transit train, like a partially subway and it's partially elevated. It's still there. I wanted to go for a ride on the L. Said to my parents, and my dad said, well, that's a great idea. Rosemary, you take me on the L. And my mother, who was frightened of being outside of her house for most of her life, had to take a deep breath. And we got on the L train. It was marginally packed with Black people. First time I'd ever seen anyone who was not white. And I couldn't help myself but not turning around and staring at all these folks. I think I must have been about 4 or 5 or something like that. And they were all staring back at me. They couldn't believe this little white kid looking at them so intently. And my mother would pull me around, no, come, don't look at them. Don't be a buffoon. And I, of course, got up and took another look. That was my first introduction to people of different color. Yeah, and it was one of many to come, but that was the first one. And I'm from Walworth County, Wisconsin. So we're neighbors.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in? Jane? You've got to unmute.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in a family culture. My father was from the South in North Carolina. Family were slave owners. I have incredible documentation of the worth and value of some of the slaves they own and all of that. So I grew up in a family on my father's side that had this history, and because he grew up in the South, his acceptance of the fact that of Black people being other, inferior. And even though, because of the nature of his position and like there were Black people in and out of my life, but on the periphery, they were always in working positions. And there was always the attitude that they were different. And so my sense, I think, as I think about it, is that innately, this was wrong to me. This was out of sync with what seemed like was the right way of thinking. And I've spent most of my life sort of struggling with this and what does it mean and what did it mean in my family? Coming to terms with the anger and shame and embarrassment of my family owning slaves, and ultimately starting to read a lot of reading of things written by Black authors, particularly Black women, all of the ones that we're all mostly familiar with, as a pathway to understanding the Black culture, life, way of being in the world, and just coming to terms with it, I guess. It just seems all pervasive in my life.
Thank you. Anybody else want to?
One of the things that comes to my mind, I think it was in sixth or seventh grade, they built a meat market next. We didn't live in a residential neighborhood. It was kind of, it happened. I mean, the area that we lived in Lake, south of Tacoma. And there was a meat market, regular, where you go in and say, okay, I want 2 pork chops type of meat market, the whole days. And people came, my mother would walk over at the end of the day and decide which was going to cook for dinner, kind of thing. So, but what I found out then, and then you would get mixed marriages coming in, and it would always be a Black man and a white woman who were military, because there was a lot of military presence, I mean, as far as the Army and the Air Force close by. And like Fort Lewis and McChord were 2 of the only bases. I mean, there were other bases across the country. But in the United States, there were very few that would take mixed marriages on their base. And there's some other things that have happened in my life or been exposed to and so forth. But that really stood out. It's something, there was a government policy. Yeah. And who would be able to come. And most of the wives were not from Iowa, or no, I'm not picking on a place, but they were from Europe. That came with them, and a lot of them German. And that would have been mid-50s, 60s, and meat market's still open too, but different owners. Yeah. But
Anita had her hand up.
Anita.
Hi. Yeah, I have a experience too. I was in high school. Actually, I also grew up in Wisconsin, in a little village in the middle of the state. And there were no African Americans. There were a few Native Americans. But my grade school and high school class were all white. I think I don't recall anyone with a skin of color. And I don't know when I sort of, what I must have been reading something, or I don't know how I came to kind of the realization, but I went to a summer program at Northwestern University. I think it was my sophomore year. And I wrote ahead when I was accepted to this program that if possible, I would like to have a roommate who was African American. And they never wrote back. I had no idea, but I got to Chicago and my dad was with me, and a cousin who lived in Evanston met us at Northwestern, and walked into the dorm room, and sure enough, I had a Black roommate, and she was just phenomenal. I think she probably ended up, being the top of her class, sort of. She was just amazing. It was so fun getting to know her and her friends as well. And at one point, she was from South Chicago, and at one time during, I think it was a 6 weeks program, she invited me home, to her home, and we drove down to this area, and while we were just at her home for the day, a neighbor, she stopped over to a next door neighbor and invited me to go along. So I think I was sort of oblivious, but after we got back to my roommate's apartment, she said, I don't think they've ever had a white person in their house before. So that was really an interesting experience where, I was the only white person around. And then my roommate's, her name was Sandy, came on a bus up to Unity, Wisconsin, in the middle of the state. And I, introduced her to my family and some of the village people. And she was received, from what I could tell, really, really well. Really, it made me feel good about my village. And then, but I have to add, then I went, when I was in college, and I had a friend who was from New York City, and living in the same dorm as me. And she came up to my village, and she was Jewish and was treated just abominably. Mm-hmm. I mean, people made comments in front of her that, oh, it was horrible. I was so ashamed and so embarrassed and so hurt. And she was deeply hurt. So, that just, anyway, that's been my experience.
What year was this? What year was this?
Oh my goodness, decades ago. Let's see. Well, probably 60 years ago. I'm 75.
19 what? 19?
Well, it would have been 19. 1960, early 60s.
Yes.
Hmm. Yeah.
I grew up in a Baptist family, and that was a very strong influence on how I viewed race. And I was in a Baptist group at the University of Iowa. This was 1953, and the group was mixed group. All the football players were there, and there was really an interest in sharing between groups. But it was you were in a situation where it was a natural flow of communication and interaction. And I was very proud of the fact that I was in that group. University of Iowa had, in 1954, had a black queen, princess of the Iowa football team season. And I'm proud of that. What I'm not proud of is that, we've been indoctrinated so that we don't realize what our strengths are and how to communicate. We're on a knife edge, it seems to me, a lot of the times with when you're in a interracial situation. And somehow we've got to learn some new lessons about communication and interaction, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Jerry. That's absolutely right. That's what we're trying to do here, right?
That's right.
Well, maybe let's move on to think about what struck you most powerfully about section 2 of this book? Jefferson, maybe? Some of the great contradictions in that life. Some of our great men don't look so great when we look very close, huh?
I was struck by the religious ideology that formed the racist notions and perpetuated them in the 16th and 17th centuries, and as in going forward from that point forward. But the root of it was Christian interpretation, and that so strangely that it had to do with the origins within Puritanism. So I didn't know that.
I was saying to Reed earlier, I grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, and we heard a lot about Puritans, but even as a kid, I thought they were weird. But the repression, the meanness of it is obvious, even, all the way down, and yet these were considered to be great men too. I think that this whole bunch of people who were so cranky they couldn't live in England, they got thrown out and came to start a new country, and they started it off on a really unfortunate foot, didn't they?
One of the things that's interesting about Jefferson is that I learned that I knew he was a slaveholder. I knew about the mistreatment and weird treatment of the Hemings family and Sally Hemings, but I didn't realize that he had actually written words for the Declaration of Independence that would indicate a rejection of slavery that were later taken out. So his contradictions about his view that slavery was a cruel war against human nature was something that he held even as he owned other humans.
Yes.
John?
I have a thought about Jefferson, and it's not based on a lot of study of his life, but just thinking of him as a man formed by the Enlightenment. And that was a real break with the Puritan frame of reference. And he was a man accustomed to a kind of aristocratic place in his society. And I think he probably claimed, well, I can live with contradictions. I don't have to follow one set of rules all the time. We may impose a kind of simplistic, moralistic perspective on someone who certainly lived by high ideals, but also made accommodations to something that was inconsistent with those ideals. So I would be inclined to give Jefferson a break in some respects.
Anybody else?
I think the contradiction that John just pointed out is still quite current in our society today, so that we can honor extraordinary wealthy people, and then they can act like idiots. And you wonder, how did that idiot get to have billions of dollars? And I think that, the thing that Jefferson was dealing with was perhaps similar. I don't, just from what I don't know much about him either, but it seems like there was an acceptance at the time that the nation was founded of this kind of duality, and we certainly, at least my understanding of current life is that we accept a similar kind of duality in terms of money and more. But in terms of money, I think it's really obvious.
Yeah, exactly. That meritocracy has become a financial meritocracy in many ways. That is pretty far afield from the so-called.
So there's a corrupting influence in all of it. There's a corrupting. Maybe at the time the meritocracy had a real true function in relation to Tammany Hall and that sort of corruption. But it is as corrupt today as Tammany Hall was in the 1870s, and that you don't need to have too much merit to recognize the corruption.
Anybody got some thoughts about uplift, suasion?
Yeah, I do.
Thank you, Caroline.
That was the chapter I really liked. It was also 2 pages long, which was great. But I think in its shortness, it really was, something about simplicity. It makes you stop and think a little bit deeper. I think it's actually a very complex topic. And this book written for younger people, to my mind, in many ways, leaves out much of the context and some of the more, complicated questions people were trying to answer and moving in a direction, and yet you've got certain limitations and so on. I actually didn't mind that it was written very starkly and very simply. I just thought that for a young person, it might be difficult to really have a deep set of thinking about it. But I would imagine that there'd be a lot of conversation. But I thought the general point of, it's important to keep in mind, because it would be a cornerstone of assimilationist thought, which basically said, make yourself small, make yourself unthreatening, make yourself the same, make yourself safe, make yourself quiet, to make white people comfortable with your existence. I really get that. I think that's right. And if at a certain time in history, what that might mean still is we're all trying to get ahead. We're trying to, uplift ourselves generally. And if you've got a dominant culture that's not ready to take you on as yourself, what are the strategies then to go about, uplifting yourself and your family? And I thought it was super interesting. I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of the context in which assimilationist thinking happens.
Yeah, I think there definitely is more of that in the book ahead. Brian has his hand up.
Yeah, Brian and then Jerry.
Yeah, I understand the description of assimilation and uplift suasion, and I'm glad he went into that because I've heard those terms and I have a much deeper understanding of what they are now than I did before. And I can see the problems with expecting, white people to act like the dominant culture in this country in order to be accepted, and they shouldn't need to do that. I thought he was a little bit overly hard, though, on some people from the past, particularly Black leaders or Black intellectuals in the past, like W.E.B. Du Bois. He says of him, he was the king of assimilation, calls him the emperor of uplift suasion. Says Du Bois even went so far as to blame Black people for being mistreated, blame them for fighting back, which meant he blamed them for being lynched. And he also says, and Du Bois wasn't the only Black man who believed Black men were bad. Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass. To me, this sort of language is it's hyperbole and exaggeration, and it's kind of disdainful of people who, in their time, didn't have a lot of options to survive in the society. This goes back to the previous woman's comment about context. I don't think they provide enough context when they make these criticisms. What were the options for a Black man wanting an education in the early 20th century, or an artist wanting to have their work make an impact? They talk about, W.E.B. Du Bois wanting to promote artists of the Harlem Renaissance, and thought they were catering too much to white tastes. And he criticizes even the NAACP for wanting to get cases into court to establish legal rights for Black people, saying that they were dressing, there were refined folks like W.E.B. Du Bois. And I just don't know what other options Kendi and Reynolds would have people in those days choose. Armed resistance, further segregation from white society by retreating to Black-only neighborhoods. So I just thought some of those criticisms were a bit over the top and really unwarranted.
Thank you, Brian. Jerry, you got your hand up?
No, I don't.
He said he does.
Yeah, I'll be the hand watcher. How about that?
Okay.
Oh, we've got the mystic hand again.
Right.
We see hands on this side that you don't see on your side.
It is interesting to me. The one of the things that Reynolds says at the beginning of the book is that this is not a history, and so I'm thinking that there's a part of this that is speaking very much to young people today, and trying to identify the stances relative to racism and anti-racism. And in the book, we haven't gotten there yet, but Reynolds is pretty clear that he thinks that W.E.B. Du Bois changes his attitude as his life goes on. And rather than conforming or trying to identify uplift blacks as being examples of the right way to go. He comes to a view later in his life that that's basically catering to the dominant society. And I think that there's a level, we were talking before about Barack Obama and the challenges that he faced when he had to basically disown his pastor. Maybe he didn't have to, but he did in his effort to run for president, because the pastor's comments were seen as too inflammatory, as not assimilationist enough. Marcy has her hand up.
Yeah, I would just like to sort of bring this, into today too, this uplift suasion. As a Japanese American whose parents had gone to the detention camps during the war, is the reminder that it doesn't work. I mean, in addition to all the other things that are, wrong with it, or people who argue for or against it, it doesn't work. If you look at the origins of the Japanese American group on Bainbridge Island, they were diligent farmers. They were taking the worst land and preparing it for farming, and had their own produce sort of processing places to sell it. They were becoming successful and becoming visible, working hard, and trying to better themselves and their families. And they got sent off to the camps. It didn't work. And they came when they came back, I know for my parents, they really wanted to, do the uplift suasion thing and be small, be non-threatening, don't stand out. But they did want their children to take advantage of the public school system, work hard, be diligent, get a good education, and try and be the best people that they could. So even though I think underneath it all, they didn't, they wanted to believe that it works. Asian hate and the kinds of things that are going on now, it to me, it just says it's not the way that's going to create equity.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to that? Yeah, this example right in our local history is very painfully obvious. Thank you.
Katie Curtis has her hand up.
Great.
Thanks, everybody, for this conversation. It's really rich. I appreciate it. I just have to jump in and appreciate Marcy, I think your name is, what you were saying. I think that that is that context, because I've been working with that too. When my father read the book, it seemed a little harsh on people who were, really important thinkers, back in the day, and, really had a lot to share. I know that, like, for, Frederick Douglass or something, it's like, but if we didn't have them, it would be so sad. But I think it's brilliant what you said, which is it didn't work. And I think that's what they're trying to tell the teenagers today, is like, you can absorb what wisdom, but you can do the both and. And so you don't want to put them up on a pedestal. You want to learn from what didn't work And so I appreciate this conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Katie.
I was going to say that this uplifting type of a notion for new people that come into this nation, the immigrants, has plausibility. To speak to Marcy's Japanese experience, I'm descendant only of Irish people, and they started arriving in this country in 1840 to 1870, and I'm one of the few people that are still left who's more Irish than American. I sometimes like to think. However, the issue here with what he's making out to do, my understanding of the uplifting thing, is that is being applied only to people who have so much discrimination against them then and now that is takes a lot of bravery for a person of darker color to be able to interact with those of us who are not. Now, this is not, I mean, you might notice I'm very white. I can't be mistaken for anything other than European. So I'm not an example of myself, but I do know that there's a lot of hesitancy that has to be overcome almost regularly to be able to interact with being white, which is another reason I'm talking about today, but these instances today harken back to what was going on by the assimilationist doctrine that you only have to be nice. And look at this genius over here with a little bit of education. He was astounding. Or the example of other examples I've mentioned in the book. So the problem to be speaking of here is one of the legacy of slavery. It is not pertinent to talk about how those of us that are not white have what their history is and how we accept their history. And that is a common, I think it's a common perception that if only they were more like us, we would be able to get off the dime on this discrimination question. That's my perception. I'm now 76. So, but I've been trying to understand this for most of my adult lifetime. So that's what I got out of the discussion.
I've got a thought about the ways in which African-American culture has evolved. In certain ways, up to the 60s and then changing after the 60s, there is a very strong tradition of radicalism within the growing number of Black intellectuals. And that's a continuation of the pioneers like W.D. Du Bois and others in the earlier time, but they're building on the most radical thinking that can be found in that tradition. And going further, you'll see toward the end how Angela Davis becomes a kind of heroine of the book, and she's earned that. But I want to reflect a little bit on the earlier time when there was so much emphasis for Black people to become legitimate, well-behaved, middle-class members of society. And I saw this illustrated in the 50s when I went to a Jazz at the Philharmonic concert. And at the end of the concert, Billie Holiday, close to the end of her radical and just pioneering career as a singer and a representative of the opposition to lynching, and there was an angry edge to Billie Holiday's career, and also a lot of internalized kind of self-destructive behavior? Well, she performed at the end of this Jazz Philharmonic concert, and most of the Black people in the audience got up and walked out. This was the middle class, older population in Seattle of an established community that was centered on Capitol Hill and so on. A community that had success, but was also disadvantaged and discriminated against in many ways. Billie Holiday was, in their eyes, I think, a bad example, a shameful figure, and she couldn't be accepted within this assimilationist culture. So that's just a piece of the ways in which all of our cultures have evolved over the decades, I think.
Wow, I never heard that.
Yeah.
I grew up, my dad played Billie Holiday stuff all the time, and she was like a hero. And it's like, it never occurred to me she wasn't everybody's hero.
That's right. Yeah. And Martin Luther King was not everybody's hero within the Black community at the time.
Well, any community is more diverse than that. And I think, assuming that anybody is just everybody's hero is probably pretty immature, right?
Well, Martin Luther King Jr. gets a lot more palatable to everyone once we start to not quote him in his entirety.
Exactly right.
Yeah, removing context is very useful, isn't it?
Marcy iPad. If you, go ahead.
I'd like to make one more little story from my past about uplift suasion and okay, this one was my first job out of college. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I applied for a secretarial job at the Clorox company, and the HR person said you had too much education and not enough experience to be a secretary at the Clorox company, but would you like to interview for a purchasing position? I said, sure. And so that's how I got my first job out of college was, my parents owned a nursery. The community that I was in just mostly were small businesses. And so I didn't really know a lot about what kinds of jobs there were really even in business. But anyway, so during the first year that I was there, they had to do a count of how many, this was in the early 70s, and they had to do a count of how many minorities they had and how many women they had in management. And I remember one of the other buyers saying to me, and I think he was genuinely just sort of, about this. He said to me, okay, but you're Japanese American and you're successful. The Japanese Americans are successful. So, I think you're being counted as a twofer, because you're Japanese American. But, are you really, does that really count? And it was like, yeah, but, it was just sort of like, huh? So that's my little story about again, uplift suasion. And if you're successful, if you're Black or Asian or Native American or whatever, and you're successful, do you really count as one of the these minority people?
Wow, right?
The subculture, the subtext is that affirmative action means helping people who don't deserve it or can't earn it, instead of, sort of recognizing that we have been in a culture that has tipped the scales in a way that it's hiding talent and skills and things that can make this culture great. I'm afraid that we have come to the end of another hour. We are going to be meeting again. Anne, if you can help me with the date, that would be really great. The next section is number 3, and we're going to be, as you can see, we don't necessarily walk through this like a book club, the key questions and answers, but upcoming in the next section is Uncle Tom, which is a very interesting and complicated story in our history. And chapter 13 is called Complicated Abe, Abraham Lincoln's, another person who got to be easier to like in the lack of context view.
And we're going to bracket President's Day to just make that perfect. So February 13th, Monday, and February 27th, Monday, both at 1:30. And again, same format. You could have in-person seating, limited, and or be a Zoomer.